Good morning and welcome back to Breakfast at Fiji One. And with me in studio, I'm joined by our friends from the International Labour Organization. And they are here this morning to discuss with us the universal ratification of C182. And with me in studio, just to my right, is Ms. Surkafa Katafono. Very good morning to you. Surkafa is Senior National Programme Officer with ILO. And we also have Ms. Elena, Decent Work and International Labour Standards Specialist. A very good morning to you, ladies. And thank you for availing yourself and being here on Breakfast at Fiji One this morning. So C182, our viewers will be asking, what is C182? What is the ratification about? And if you could just enlighten us on the convention that is drawn up by ILO in this regard. Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you first for inviting us and for discussing this topic, because this is really for the ILO, for International Labour Organization, this is really something to discuss and to be proud of. If 2 days ago, already it was 2 days ago, August 4th, International Labour Organization achieved the universal ratification of this convention, Convention 182. This is a convention on the worst forms of child labour. What does it mean, universal ratification? That means that all 187 members of the ILO have ratified this convention, meaning that convention was approved, the ratification was approved by the national body, by the parliament of each of these member states. And I can just tell a little bit about why this convention is so important. Well, first, this is the first ever universal ratification of any ILO instrument, and that shows the commitment of the whole world, of all countries in the world, to implement this convention. What is the worst forms of child labor? Convention prohibits to use 4 worst forms of child labor, and among these 4 forms are slavery and all other forms of similar to slavery, as debt, bondage, for example. It's prohibited to use children in pornography and surrounding activities, in illicit activities like selling and production of drugs, and it's prohibited to use children in hazardous work. And each country has to develop a list of hazardous work. Hazardous works are those which are harmful for children's health or their mental development.
Thank you so much. So why was there a need for the convention? Relating, may I ask, localizing the issue to the Pacific, may I say?
Well, actually around the Pacific, the convention came about 21 years ago, 1919. It was adopted, 1999, sorry. And after that, straight after that in 2000, PNG went ahead and stepped up and ratified it, because they thought that it would be an important convention. I mean, it's not a very controversial convention. All the countries, in some form or other, they have, they would like to protect their children. So PNG stepped up in 2000. Fiji followed suit and ratified the convention in 2002. Then we followed by Vanuatu in 2006, and Samoa stepped up in 2008, Kiribati in 2009, and then Solomon's in 2012. So these were the, if you like, the older members, about 6 of them in the early 90s. And then there was a space of about 6 years, and then Cook Islands became a member in 2015, and last year in 2019 was the ILO's 100 years centenary celebration. So there was a move to try and get all the member states to ratify this very important convention by 2019 as part of the campaign for the ILO centenary. Then we had Cook Islands ratify it in 2018. And that left about 6 member states only left to ratify it. So there was a a big campaign around the Pacific to get the Pacific Islands, because we had 5 more recent, they were the, if you like, the more recent member states. So we worked with Cook Islands and they ratified it in 2018. In 2019, last year, we had 3 countries ratify. So Palau and Marshalls in March, and in June Tuvalu followed. And then we had, so the whole, when the celebrations, the ILO centenary celebrations happened, the whole world, we were waiting for Tonga. Tonga was the last one. And so Tonga didn't ratify it last year, but this year, as my colleague Elena said, on the 4th of August, they decided to ratify it. And so now we have a universal ratification. So the Pacific was sort of pushed in the forefront because everyone else had ratified it. It was like a gasp waiting for the Pacific, come on and ratify this. So then when Tonga ratified, then there was I think a celebratory rapport around the world, and we were really happy. It's, as I said, it's not controversial. Parents, teachers, everybody, politicians, everybody in the community, no one wants their children exposed to trafficking, to exploitation of some sort, to working in the street, carrying heavy loads. We all want children to have a very good childhood. You and I, we all know our childhood. Yeah. We have very good childhood. So we want that also for children around the world.
Okay. Elena, there are several key areas that countries need to focus on in order to eliminate child labor. What are some of the key areas that ILO is looking at to eliminate?
Well, ratification of convention, you are quite correct, is not their aim itself, because it's only a push and the way for the state to show the commitment to eliminate worst forms of child labor. And among the actions which states do undertake after the ratification, or some countries undertake those steps before the ratification of the convention while they are preparing, first, the states should prohibit worst forms of child labor in their legislation. And this is the first absolutely necessary step, declaring the unacceptable practices of child labor. Then penal sanctions and other forms of sanctions should be established by the state for use of worst forms of child labor, which I listed earlier. And then countries usually develop various forms of action plans, implementation plans, where they, based on the national specific situation, they decide which particular actions are needed to eliminate worst forms of child labor. What is absolutely crucial besides that is an education, because an alternative to child labor is an education. So states are required, and they try to commit to do that, to provide free education for all children, and this is free vocational education when possible, especially for those children who were earlier in worst forms of child labor. But free education, accessible free education, is absolutely key issue, and one of their ILO priorities, not only ILO but also the ILO priorities for creation of a decent childhood for kids, because the idea of the whole this convention and number of other international instruments is that children should get decent education, to have an opportunity to get decent job in the future, and not to stay in poverty, not to work in hazardous work, but to invest through their knowledge, through their education, through their capacities, into a better future for themselves, for their families, and for their countries.
You mentioned that countries need to execute plans to eliminate child labor. Have we been successful in that regard? with the
Well,
studies that have been carried out by ILO?
You mean Fiji or the Pacific region in
Fiji
general?
or in the Pacific?
I would say that the situation is different, but among those countries which Surkafa mentioned, which were like the first group of countries ratifying this Convention 182, beginning of 2000s and the first decade of 2000, among those countries, a number of efforts were undertaken, and particularly almost in all of these countries special studies were undertaken on child labor and recommendations developed on what should be done. Many countries have adopted at least legislation, but also legislation, employment legislation limiting the minimum age for children, because this Convention 182 is very closely connected with another convention on minimum age, 138, which is also ratified by many countries in the Pacific zone, not all yet. So minimum age established, lists of hazardous work were established, special procedures for labor inspection on child labor were established and developed. Yeah, and a few countries have developed national action plans to eliminate child labor. At least Fiji has this action plan, which of course it was developed a number of years ago. Now it requires consideration again, because the situation changes, and from time to time tripartite partners, ILO is working with tripartite partners, not only with governments but also with representatives of workers and employers organizations, so coming together and reconsidering, rediscussing this type of action plans is a need for each country. So we just discussed for Fiji, for example, last year that this work should be undertaken later this year. So we hope that this year or beginning next year, tripartite partners will look at the situation again, especially because now we have new consequences of the COVID-19.
Yes.
Yeah. So it really requires looking and new exercise.
So looking at the universal ratification of 182, how does a country, like for us in the Pacific, implement the convention?
Well, as so following ratification, they would then, as Yelena said, would develop a national action plan. And usually this national action plan would then put in detail what are some of the things that they can do. So usually, for instance, the case of Fiji, we have done a small, we had a European funded project, very huge one, in the years 2007 to about 2010 or 12. So in that space of time, there was a few researches done, exploitation of children. Then they moved into the legislation review. There was also a little grants given to employers, workers and government for them to work with the children out in the street, for example. We had at one time working with the wheelbarrow boys, the shoeshine
boys.
And just working, putting, some of them were not at school, so we're trying to help them to put them back into school. We've also done work with the research looked at exploitation, so trying to see if there are cases and trying to persecute those that are behind all of this. So the National Action Plan, there's also a national policy on child labor. The policy is actually in a draft form. So as Yelena said, for Fiji, we will, with the advent of COVID, we need to review all of this and try to have a look, because COVID-19 has really, I'd like to say that there was a huge improvement globally, even in Fiji. We had occupational health and safety inspectors, the border, the police, they were all, awareness was raised with them, and so they became experts at this. But COVID, with the onset of COVID-19, it has put the whole world back, because now we really need to go and review all the plans that we've had in place and try to see how COVID has, the impact of COVID, because obviously, you know, people dying will mean that there are a lot of orphans, and then orphans mean that they go back to, you know, it's a bread and butter issue, so they will go and look for work, and a lot of that has to do, work could be exploited, work could be very hard work, work could be working on the farms with chemicals, so these things definitely need a review.
So Elena, you know, unconsciously, we Pacific Islanders in Fiji, we tend to get our children to do work, but we do not know that it's against the policies and regulations that ILO has set out in this ratification program. So, you know, how does C-182 matter to us as, you know, ordinary parents like us? How does this matter?
Well, first I want to emphasize that this convention doesn't mean ratification of this convention or existence of national legislation against child labor doesn't mean that children should not do any work. Because of course children should, and this is normal in all countries, help their parents and do the work which is normal for their age, for their level of physical and mental development. Learning to do something, helping families, etc. This is normal. When it is becoming dangerous and that's why prohibited for children, then at this moment parents should stop. Yeah, for example, working in agricultural various agricultural works, working on farms, diving for example, diving somewhere deep to pick up various seafood. Yeah, something what can be either because of their working conditions or because of the length of this work or because of their interaction with some, for example, chemicals in agriculture. Everything what can endanger children because of their age, everything what can endanger their physical health and development and opportunity to develop and grow normally, those types of work are prohibited. Because there is, this is already a different convention which I mentioned already on minimum age. It provides restrictions what is the minimum age for hazardous work, which is 18 years old. People under 18 years old should never work on hazardous work. But there are also the general age when the employment for adolescents is possible, which is below 15, it is below 18. In some countries it is 15, in some countries it is 16, their age of graduation from regular school, but some countries, lower developed countries, they're even allowed to establish this age at 14. Yeah, and then there are light works for which the age of employment, age of work is even lower than this. But like what families should remember, what parents should understand, they never should make a choice between education, between sending a child to school and receiving good education, which gives all the opportunity to children, to their children in the future, and making money right now, today. Yeah, because it's always like using children for work for long hours, for dangerous, hazardous work now, while children are during their school age, may really create very negative consequences for their future. So that's where both school children, labor inspectors, but first of all, of course, parents and families should be very cautious and should be very, very attentive.
And sometimes children, they should be at school during the school hours, but they've been sent out to, you know, sell things and earn money for their family. So yeah.
And I know time is catching up on us. Just the last message from the two ladies. What happens next now that we have C-182 being the first ILO convention to achieve universal ratification? So what happens next from now?
Well, I think a lot of various consequences and lots of things will happen for us here in the Pacific. The first priority will be to suggest our support to Tonga, because Tonga just ratified 2 days ago, this convention, and now they will have to make all this way forward to implement this convention, develop national action plan, check whether all the proper procedures exist and whether some additional support measures, including in legislation on practices, are required. So we will suggest this support to Tonga, but with all other countries, as we mentioned, with COVID-19 situation, which really worsened the situation of many families, and many children returned from school to walk to streets. Like, of course, we will need to see how we can support those children and return them back to school.
Yeah, so it's just it's just the beginning of a journey. The universal ratification is fine, but now we have to start to do the work, more work, really.
So basically, what the two ladies are saying, it's everyone working in collaboration to try and eliminate child labor to to the worst stage. Yes, children can take part in whatever work we have around at home, the little chores that they do, but not to the extent that it'll harm them or bring expose them to chemicals and other activities that they are prone to. So thank you very much to the ladies from ILO for being with us, and we look forward to many more meetings like this in the near future. So stay with us. We have more after the break.